The cottonwood tree stood like a weathered gravestone against the merciless August sun, its bark scarred by years of prairie winds, and now bearing fresh wounds from a knife blade. Boone Carver hung against its trunk, thick hemp ropes cutting deep into his wrists, where dried blood had crusted black beneath torn skin. His face was a grotesque mask of purple bruises and swollen flesh, dirt caked in the split corners of his mouth. The relentless heat had baked his shirt to his back, and black flies swarmed the open cuts where his struggles had torn the fabric away. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a monumental effort against the crushing weight of dehydration and pain. The message carved into the bark above his head told its own story. This is what happens to those who cross the Brody gang. A crude drawing of a noose had been etched beside it, still dripping sap like blood. 20 feet away, a silver-gray Mustang pawed the hard-packed earth, its wild eyes fixed on the bound man with predatory intensity. The horse's mane caught the light like spun metal, and every muscle in its powerful frame spoke of untamed freedom. This was Ghost, a legend among the ranchers of the territory, a Mustang that had never felt rope or saddle, never bowed to any man's will. Boone's revolver still hung at his hip, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly out of reach. His vision blurred as waves of heat distortion rose from the baked earth, but he could smell something else on the wind and the acrid scent of approaching trouble. 4 days earlier, Boone Carver had been a different man. At 28, he ran a modest spread near Bitter Creek, with calloused hands and a determination that had carved a living from the unforgiving prairie. His ranch house was simple but sturdy, built by his own hands after he'd scraped together enough money to claim the land. The cattle bore his brand, a simple C, with a line through it, and represented years of backbreaking work under the endless sky. But Boone carried a weight heavier than any physical labor. 5 years ago, his older brother Samuel had been lynched by a mob in Bitter Creek's main street, accused of murdering a bank clerk during a robbery. The evidence had seemed ironclad. Samuel's distinctive silver-handled knife found at the scene, his chestnut mare spotted fleeing town witnesses who swore they'd seen his bearded face beneath a black hat. What Boone had discovered through 3 years of careful investigation had shattered everything he'd believed. The real killers were the Brody gang 3 brothers who'd terrorized the territory with brutal efficiency. But the gang had secrets of their own, cracks in their unity that Boone had only recently begun to understand. Marcus, the eldest at 35, was a cold-blooded killer who planned their operations with military precision. He'd served in the Confederate Army until deserting after a massacre he'd orchestrated against Union prisoners. Jacob, the middle brother at 32, had fists like hammers and a taste for violence that went beyond necessity. But it was the youngest, Clem, barely 22, who troubled Boone most. The boy had the dead eyes of a man who'd killed without conscience. Yet Boone had noticed something in recent months, a hesitation, when Marcus gave orders, a flicker of doubt that suggested not all was well within the gang. Boone had gathered damning evidence over the years. Samuel's knife had been stolen from their ranch a week before the robbery. The chestnut mare was actually a gelding the Brodys had stolen from a ranch in the next county, and the witnesses had been paid to lie. But more importantly, he'd learned that the bank clerk had recognized Jacob during the robbery and had to be silenced. They'd needed a scapegoat, and Samuel, a known drinker with a reputation for bar fights, had been perfect. The Brodys had struck his ranch 3 weeks ago, making off with 60 head of his best cattle. They'd left behind their calling card a dead calf with its throat slit, a warning that anyone who pursued them would suffer the same fate. But Boone had seen his chance. If he could catch them with his stolen cattle, force them to confess, he could finally clear Samuel's name. He'd ridden out at dawn on Tuesday, August 12th, following their trail into the Badlands known as Dead Crow's Hollow, a maze of arroyos and mesas where the law had never reached. The Brodys had chosen their hideout well, in a box canyon with walls that turned the place into a natural fortress. Boone had been careful, watching from the ridge above, as they divided up his cattle among their existing herd. But as he'd prepared to withdraw, he'd overheard something that changed everything. "I'm getting tired of this, Marcus," Clem had said, his young voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "All this killing, all this blood. Maybe it's time we moved on to California like we talked about." Marcus had backhanded the boy across the face. "You getting soft on me, little brother, because soft men don't survive out here." "I ain't soft," Clem had replied, but his voice had carried a note of rebellion that made Boone's pulse quicken. "I just think maybe we've pushed our luck far enough." Jakob had laughed a sound like grinding stone. "The boy's right about one thing, we're sitting on enough stolen cattle to buy ourselves a ranch in California. Question is, what do we do about witnesses?" The look that passed between Marcus and Jacob had been answer enough. They planned to kill Clem once they'd sold the cattle, eliminate the one member of their gang who might eventually turn against them. But they needed him. For now, needed his gun and his knowledge of the territory. That's when the rattlesnake had spooked Boone's horse, sending echoes through the canyon that brought all three brothers running with rifles in hand. The ambush had been swift and brutal. Boone had tried to fight, but 3 against 1 with rifles against a single pistol had been hopeless odds. They'd dragged him down from the ridge, beaten him with fists and rifle butts, until he could barely see, then tied him to the cottonwood tree. "You want to know what happened to your brother?" Marcus had whispered in his ear as they'd bound him tight. "Same thing that's going to happen to you. But first, you're going to tell us who else knows about our operation." They'd ridden off at sunset on Tuesday, promising to return the next morning after they'd moved his cattle to a buyer in the next territory. But something had delayed them, probably the difficulty of moving 60 head of stolen cattle through rough terrain without being seen. Now it was Thursday afternoon, and Boone could hear the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the south. The whistle came from his cracked lips like a prayer, weak and trembling, but carrying a melody that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat. It was an old tune one Samuel had taught him during the long winters when they'd huddled around the fire in their childhood home. "You whistle like this," Samuel had said, demonstrating the low warbling call, "and the Mustangs will know you're friend, not foe." Father learned it from the Lakota, and they learned it from the horses themselves. Ghost moved closer, drawn by the sound and the scent of blood that triggered some deep, protective instinct in the stallion's brain. The Mustang had seen men die before, had learned to associate the smell of violence with danger to all living things. "Go on," Boone whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get out of here before they come back." But Ghost had already caught another scent on the wind, and the smell of unwashed men and gun oil, the acrid stench of violence that clung to the Brody brothers like a second skin. The Mustang's ears swiveled forward, and its nostrils flared as it tested the air. The thunder of hoofbeats reached them at the same moment, 3 riders cresting the ridge at a gallop. The Brodys had returned their laughter, carrying across the distance, like the cries of carrion birds. "Well, I'll be damned," Jakob shouted, reining in his horse as he spotted the Mustang. "Look what we got here, boys. That's Ghost himself, standing pretty as you please." Marcus Brody's eyes glittered with greed as he dismounted, his rifle held ready. "That horse is worth more than all the cattle we've stolen this month. Question is, how do we take him without getting ourselves killed?" Clem slid from his saddle, but Boone noticed something different about the youngest brother. His hand trembled slightly as he drew his revolver, and his eyes kept darting between Marcus and the bound cowboy, with an expression that might have been guilt. "I say we shoot the cowboy first," Jakob growled, working the lever of his Winchester. "Then worry about the horse." "No," Marcus said firmly, never taking his eyes off Ghost. "We do this smart. That Mustang bolts at the first gunshot and we lose our prize. We handle this quiet-like." The first shot came from Jakob's rifle, aimed not at Ghost, but at the ground near the Mustang's hooves. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt and stone, and Ghost reared on its hind legs, a magnificent display of power that sent the Brody's horses dancing sideways in terror. "Careful, you fool," Marcus barked. "You spook that horse too much, and it'll run clear to Mexico." But Ghost didn't run. Instead, it wheeled and lashed out with hooves that could crush a man's skull, forcing Jacob to jerk his mount back to avoid being struck. The Mustang's eyes were wild with fury, but it kept its position between Boone and the riders. The brothers spread out with practiced efficiency, but as they closed in, Boone saw his chance. "Clem." He called out, his voice hoarse but carrying. "Your brothers are planning to kill you. I heard them talking yesterday." The effect was immediate. Clem's revolver wavered, and he shot a sharp look at Marcus. "What's he talking about?" "Nothing," Marcus said quickly. "Just trying to divide us. Don't listen to him." But Boone pressed on, desperation, giving strength to his voice. "They said you're getting soft, said they'd put a bullet in your back once you've outlived your usefulness." Jacob's laugh was ugly. "Kid's got a point there, Clem. You have been getting mighty squeamish lately." The look that passed between the brothers was electric with tension. Clem's face went pale, and his gun hand began to shake. "Is that true, Marcus? Are you planning to kill me?" Marcus's reply was to swing his rifle toward his youngest brother. "I'm planning to kill anyone who gets in my way, including family." The standoff that followed lasted only seconds, but in that time, Ghost acted. The Mustang's teeth found the rope binding Boone's wrists, and with a powerful shake of its head, it began to work at the knots with desperate urgency. Clem's revolver roared the bullet, taking Marcus in the shoulder and spinning him around. Jacob cursed and swung his rifle toward his youngest brother, but Clem was already moving, diving behind a boulder, as return fire chipped stone around him. "You always said family was everything," Clem shouted from cover. "But you were ready to put me in the ground." The rope gave with a sharp crack, and Boone collapsed forward, his legs too weak to support him after hours of being bound upright. Ghost knelt beside him, an unprecedented gesture from a wild Mustang. Boone hauled himself onto the horse's back, his torn hands tangling in the silver mane. That's when the rifle shot rang out from the ridge above them, not from the Brody's weapons, but from someone else entirely. "Dakota," Boone whispered, recognition flooding through him like cold water. Dakota White Eagle stood silhouetted against the sky rifle, smoking in his hands. The Lakota tracker had been Boone's closest friend and ally in gathering evidence against the Brodys. Boone had told him about the plan to follow the gang into Dead Crow's Hollow, but he'd insisted on going alone. "You boys picked the wrong man to torture." Dakota called down, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "And you're in my hunting ground now." Marcus struggled to his feet, blood soaking his shirt from Clem's bullet. His face was twisted with rage and pain. "Dakota White Eagle," he snarled. "This ain't your fight, Indian." The response was another rifle shot that took Marcus's hat clean off his head. "The cowboy is my friend. That makes it my fight." But the distraction had given Ghost the opening it needed. The Mustang rose smoothly to its feet, with Boone clinging to its back, then began to move toward the canyon's mouth. Behind them, the gunfight between the brothers continued. Clem's position growing more desperate with each passing moment. "But this ain't over," Jacob roared, turning his rifle toward the fleeing pair. "You hear me, Carver? This ain't over." The canyon mouth opened before them, like the gates of hell, a narrow passage between towering walls where the shadows lay thick and deceptive. Ghost's hooves struck sparks from the stone as they navigated the treacherous path, Boone's vision swimming with exhaustion and blood loss. But as they reached the narrowest point, disaster struck. A rifle bullet fired from somewhere above caught Boone in the side, tearing through muscle and scraping bone. He screamed and nearly fell from Ghost's back, his blood spattering the Mustang's silver coat. "Out there," Jacob's voice echoed from the rocks. "I got him." Ghost stumbled as Boone's weight shifted the Mustang's hooves, scrambling for purchase on the loose stone. Another bullet whined past them, so close Boone could feel its heat. The wound in his side was bleeding heavily, and his strength was fading fast. That's when he saw it, a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a horse, but leading up and around their attacker's position. It was a desperate gamble, but with bullets flying around them and his life leaking away, it might be their only chance. "Can you make it?" he whispered to Ghost, his voice weak from blood loss. The Mustang's response was to gather itself like a coiled spring, every muscle tensed for the impossible climb. Ghost had been born in these canyons, had navigated worse terrain in its fight for survival. The ascent was a nightmare of loose stone and rifle fire. Bullets sparked off the canyon walls around them as Jakob tried to track their movement, his shots growing more erratic as the angle became impossible. Ghost's hooves found purchase on stone that seemed too narrow to support a mountain goat, let alone a horse carrying a wounded rider. Halfway up, Boone's grip failed. The blood loss and shock had sapped his strength, and his torn hands could no longer hold the Mustang's mane. He slid sideways, his body tilting toward the abyss. Only Ghost's quick reflexes saved him. The Mustang shifted its weight, leaning into the canyon wall to pin Boone against the stone. The move was instinctive, born of the same protective instinct that had drawn the horse to the bound cowboy in the first place. "Hold on," Boone whispered to himself, Samuel's face flashing through his mind. "Hold on for Samuel." They reached the top just as Dakota's suppressing fire drove Jakob back into cover. The Lakota tracker was wounded blood, darkening his left sleeve, where a bullet had found its mark, but his aim was still true. "This way," Dakota shouted, pointing toward a dried riverbed that cut through the Badlands. "My horse is in the wash." But as they descended toward the riverbed, Boone's wound reopened, sending fresh blood streaming down his side. His vision darkened at the edges, and he knew he was dying. The bullet had done more damage than he'd first realized, and the rough ride had torn something vital inside him. "I'm not gonna make it." He gasped, his voice barely audible over the sound of Ghost's hooves on stone. Dakota was beside them now, his own horse matching Ghost's pace as they raced through the wash. The tracker's face was grim as he saw the extent of Boone's injuries. "Yes, you are," he said firmly. "You've got too much to live for." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Jakob and Clem had found horses and were closing the distance, their rifles ready. The wounded Marcus had been left behind, but his brothers were driven by the fury of men who'd seen their plans collapse. "There," Jakob's voice carried over the sound of hoofbeats. "I see them." A rifle shot cracked behind them, the bullet buzzing past Boone's ear like an angry hornet. Ghost swerved, nearly throwing his rider, but kept running. The Mustang's flanks were dark with exertion, and foam flecked its muzzle. The race continued through the afternoon, a deadly game of cat and mouse across the brutal landscape. Bullets flew around them like deadly rain, some coming so close that Boone could feel the wind of their passage. His blood loss was severe now, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, only Ghost's steady rhythm keeping him upright. As the sun began to set, they reached the edge of Bitter Creek's territory. The town was still miles away, but this was civilized country, where the law still held sway. Behind them, the Brody's pursuit had faltered, their horses blown, and their ammunition running low. "We made it," Dakota said, his voice filled with relief. "We actually made it." But Boone was beyond speech, now his body held upright only by willpower and Ghost's careful gait. The Mustang seemed to sense its rider's condition, picking its way carefully through the gathering darkness. They reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek, just as the church bells were ringing 8 o'clock. Sarah Mackenzie, the schoolteacher, was the first to see them, her face going white as she took in the blood-soaked figure clinging to the Mustang's back. "Dear God," she whispered, running to help as Ghost finally stopped in her yard. "Get the doctor, get the sheriff." Dr. Peterson arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand. He took one look at Boone's condition and shook his head grimly. "He's lost too much blood. I'm not sure." "You save him," Dakota said fiercely. You save him or I'll hold you responsible." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Sheriff Tom Bradley organized a posse to return to Dead Crow's Hollow, while Dr. Peterson worked to save Boone's life. The cowboy drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever spiking as infection set in. But it was during his delirium that Boone made his most important discovery. As the doctor cleaned his wounds, a blood-stained piece of paper fell from his shirt pocket, evidence he'd grabbed during the chaos of the gunfight. Without realizing it, the paper was a letter written in Marcus Brody's distinctive handwriting. It was addressed to a banker in the territorial capital, detailing the gang's plan to frame Samuel Carver for the murder they'd committed. The letter was dated a week before Samuel's death, proving premeditation. "This is it," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice filled with wonder. "This is the proof we've been looking for." The posse found the Brody's camp abandoned, but they didn't have far to look. Jacob and Clem had been captured by a patrol of territorial marshals, their crimes finally catching up with them. Marcus was found dead in the canyon, his wound having proven fatal. But the biggest surprise came when Clem, faced with the certainty of hanging, offered to turn state's evidence. The young man's conscience had finally overcome his loyalty to his brothers, and he provided detailed testimony about all their crimes, including the murder that had led to Samuel's lynching. The trial was swift and decisive. With Clem's testimony and the blood-stained letter as evidence, the truth about Samuel's innocence was finally revealed. The territorial governor issued a formal pardon posthumously, and a memorial was erected in Bitter Creek Cemetery. But for Boone, the real healing began when he woke up 3 days later to find Ghost standing outside his window. The Mustang had refused to leave, had waited patiently while its rider fought for life. "You came back?" Boone whispered, his voice still weak from his ordeal. Ghost nuzzled his hand through the open window, the same gesture that had saved his life in the canyon. The bond between them had been forged in fire and blood, and it would never be broken. Over the following weeks, as Boone slowly recovered, their relationship deepened. Ghost never wore a saddle or bridle, but would carry his rider across the high country with the grace of a dancer. The Mustang had kept its wild spirit, but it had also found something it had never known before: a true partner. The story of the Mustang and the Cowboy spread throughout the territory. But for Boone, it was simpler than any legend. He had found justice for his brother, had survived an ordeal that should have killed him, and had gained a companion whose loyalty transcended the normal bonds between man and horse. As he sat on his porch each evening watching Ghost graze in the pasture, Boone reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. The Brody gang was gone, their reign of terror ended by their own internal conflicts. Samuel's name was cleared, his grave now marked with honor instead of shame. And in the vast expanse of the American frontier, a cowboy and a Mustang had proven that sometimes, in the darkest moments, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The legend would live on, but the reality was even better: a story of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between kindred spirits in the face of impossible odds.